To use the old turn of phrase, I'm about to introduce someone who needs no introduction. I have been pleased and honored to have known Gary Hart since his first campaign for Congress back in 1973-74. We were then in the depths of the Cold War, and I remember Gary's aphorism for dealing with defense budgets was more isn't better, better is better. Something that we might bear in mind going forward even today. Gary's academic credentials, as well as his political credentials, are more than distinguished. A Bachelor of Divinity degree from Yale, a law degree from Yale, a PhD from Oxford, and service that started very early on the Church Commission to look at the CIA's misadventures back in the 70s, shortly before 9/11, and prescient his service with Warren Rudman on the Hart-Rudman Commission, looking at challenges the country then ought to be facing to national security, and then with authoring many books, including novels and mysteries with his pal, Bill Cohen. So please join me in welcoming Senator Gary Hart.
Thank you, David. Unaccustomed as I am to speaking, I had hoped to get a chuckle. Thank you. I just haven't spoken much in recent times. What I am unaccustomed to is sermonizing or preaching, but I have a story to tell about that, which I will do momentarily. I want to begin by thanking the presiding minister here this morning, Reverend Linda Kowach, for her hospitality, and to all of you for taking the time to be here and to welcome me. I also very much want to thank David Skaggs, with whom I had the honor of serving the people of Colorado and the nation in the United States Congress. As fate would have it, yesterday my son John and I had lunch with Tim and Ren Worth, part-time residents here in Boulder, whom I think almost all of you know. David and Tim and I served together, and we're honored to do so on behalf of all of you and the 5 million people who we share this state with. Now, the issue about preaching sermons, there's a story. And it has to do with the fact that my saintly mother was informed early in her marriage that she would not be able to have children. So several years went by, and I showed up, much to her doctor's surprise. So dear Mom concluded this was a gift from God and that I had a divine mission here on earth, and she undertook at a fairly early age in our church in a small town in Kansas to encourage the minister we had at the time. They tended to come and go very rapidly, that I should be given the opportunity to occupy the pulpit. I was still a schoolboy, and so he thought that was a pretty good idea, took his chances, and asked me to prepare a sermon, which I did. And if I can remember back all those years, I preached from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 19, which was part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and in which there is a single sentence that was the theme of that sermon. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, when I announced that to the congregation, they sort of looked at each other and wondered where I was going to go with this, because when you read it, it sounds pretty obvious. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That is, whatever you think is most important, you will pay attention to that. Now, we know there are people whose treasure is property, jewelry, watches, I shouldn't say it, guns. And for many of them, whatever that treasure is, they spend a lot of time thinking about that. The closest I came, coming from a working class family, was to treasure books, which I've done all my life. So I know a bit about the connection between the treasure and what you think about it. I love books, I still do. We've run out of room at our house for those books, but doesn't stop me from buying some more. So anyway, that was the sermon, and I'll come back to that probably at the end of my thoughts. I gave David for a topic, the politics of morality. It could have been the morality of politics. And what I want to reflect briefly on today, very briefly, are instances in which our nation, and I am using morality here, not in the individual sense of is someone moral or not moral. I'm talking about the morality of a nation, in this case, the United States of America. Now let's take a couple of minutes to think about our history by way of illustration. I expect everybody here has read some, if not a good deal, of American history. And all of us know from our earliest schooling the climactic, threatening period of our Civil War. And it was the issue, obviously, of the ownership by one person of another person. But in practice, the owner was white and the owned person was black. We all know this came to a head finally in the mid-19th century when asked repeatedly about what slavery meant. One of the most obvious founders, Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, said, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we cannot let go." That also is pretty profound when you think about it. He knew, first of all, that the Union could not have been formed to begin with these years ago, which we are celebrating tomorrow, without concessions made to the slave-owning South. We won't go into all that because we know the story. I expect Jefferson, being an intelligent man, knew sooner or later, and in fact, some of his letters reflected this, that it would come to blows, that Americans who could not stand slavery, largely in the North, but not totally, would insist that those in the South who owned slaves get rid of them. And it came to be when the war broke out that even Southerners and a few Northerners who did not own slaves felt that it was the right of their fellow citizens in the region to do so if that's what they wanted or if that's what their finances required. Well, we come, as the reading suggests, to the great, incomparable Abraham Lincoln, who insisted when the war broke out, even before that, but throughout the early years of the war, that this was a fight to keep the Union together. By the time it became apparent that he was going to have to emancipate the slaves, issue a decree declaring that all the slaves were free, he had come around, and I think one of the most interesting developments of human character, to the point of view that the morality of being an American required that no group of Americans, no group of citizens in this country could own other citizens or other people. And that the issue wasn't just politics, keeping the Union together. The issue was what's right and what's wrong, which is about as close as anyone can come to defining morality, certainly for a nation. And in the closing months of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made that war about what is morally right and morally wrong. Tragically, well, first of all, happily, we kept the Union together. He did, with help. But as time went on, there were still those in parts of this country who refused to accept the fact that slaves were citizens or that they deserved equal rights with the rest of us. So morality eventually prevailed, but the struggle goes on, and we're all familiar with events of recent times where old-time traditional racism continues to rear its ugly head. It will not go away. The hope is that in younger generations who have not heard the lessons of the old days and heard all of the ignorant, false statements fellow citizens have made about the African American race. But no part of American history, an awful lot of American history, has moral implications. No part of that history is more profoundly about morality and not just politics than the elimination of slavery and the long, hard struggle that succeeded that in making African American Americans full citizens in our country. And we still struggle to this day getting concurrence from the courts, from both political parties, that African Americans deserve equal voting rights with all of the rest of us. And that fight must go on. Let me give you another illustration that's also timely because of events of the last couple of weeks. The role of women in our society, gender equality. Our country was founded, as we know, by figures from the European Enlightenment, particularly English and Scottish Enlightenment, and they brought the lessons that they had learned in Europe with them. But what they did not bring with them was a sense, because in many of the countries they came from, women were still second-class citizens. So it took from the founding of this nation to the Constitution guaranteeing women, half of the people in this country, the right to vote, 130 years. Women, to their credit, in the late 19th century and beyond, well into the 20th century, continued to insist, rightly, that they be full-class citizens, that they have every right to vote just like males in our society. And, as we know, in the second half of the 20th century, economic rights, the right to advance, the right to lead, the right to be elected. I didn't check, David, when we were in the Congress, the number of women there, but it's certainly much, much higher now. And I'm happy to say, to remind you, that one of the pioneers was Pat Schroeder from this state, insisted in the halls of Congress that women be given leadership positions, be listened to, be treated equally, and to lead. Now, we're going to have a discussion period later on, and I think something tells me that the issue of Supreme Court rulings in the last 2 or 3 weeks are going to come up, as well they should. It does cause people who have studied our history, including me, to wonder if anything in America ever gets finally settled. You can reach your own conclusion about that, particularly when presidents insist on politicizing the courts generally and the highest court particularly. Equality for women, that's not a political issue. That's a moral issue. We've gone from the 19th to the 20th century. Now, I'll pick one final example for the 21st century. That is our climate. I can't think of an issue which we confront that is not as profoundly moral as what we do with the climate that we leave our children. Anyone who wants to argue about temperatures and the oceans and all the rest of it, first of all, the catastrophe is already on us, in case you haven't noticed, with floods, fires, melting glaciers, and all the rest of it. It's not going to get any better until we grow up. So the moral challenge of our country, if it chooses to lead once again, is to insist that all countries meet standards that leave for our children air they can breathe, water they can drink, land that is not polluted by chemicals, and a healthy environment for future generations. These illustrations of slavery, of women's emancipation, of protecting the climate are, in my judgment at least, profoundly moral issues. Now, David and I had the honor of serving, and I was thinking in preparing for today how many issues on a daily basis that we faced and that our successors continue to face. Housing, health care, shelter, education, on and on. Each of these has a moral side to it. Now, I'm not here today to argue that we overturn the First Amendment, separation of church and state. I am here to suggest for you to think about how much we write off as politics, and that's a lot, often conceals or covers up very profound moral issues for all of us, not just in our country, but for all of us around the world. Too much can be made of that, and I don't intend to do that. But think about it, particularly now. And I guess I moved to this, explicate this theme of morality in politics, because politics, David, has gotten so crass. So crass. I served in the Senate in the 70s that I have told young people about. They can't believe it. Democrats and Republicans co-sponsored legislation and did so gladly because we shared the national interest. We shared what was common to all of us. And the Republicans that we worked with, all of whom are gone, shared those concerns with us. Today, everybody's got a megaphone. Everything is sloganizing. Everything is blaming the other side. Democrats are somewhat as guilty as the other party. I won't go on that theme. But I do not recognize the mentality and personality and spirituality of some of the people who hold themselves out to be national legislators. So what do we think about when Martin Luther King says the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice? Keep that in mind, because he's absolutely right. If someone wants a definition of morality, I'll offer some parts of that definition. Justice, fairness, equality, inclusiveness, and the common good, the national interest. Those and much more compose what it means to be moral in a nation that claims to be democratic. Sometimes is, more often than not is not. So it simply asks you to think not only where your treasure is and where your heart is, but how can we restore the deep sense of morality to our politics and our governance that I think is almost lost. It can be done. People like yourself have to insist on it, have to demand it. So I leave you with those thoughts. They are reflections. This is not a sermon, in case you had mistaken. I forgot to tell you one thing before I say thank you. When I gave my first sermon, I was 11 years old. God bless you. May the people of the United States earn God's blessing. Thank you very much.